let's talk about definitions and counterexamples. Definitions will be important not only for the writing that we're going to be doing in this class, they will also be important for philosophical concepts. Take, for example, a definition of knowledge. Just think about, maybe pause for a second. Think about what knowledge means to you. What are the criteria or requirements for something to count as knowledge? Well, you might say that if you know something, you have to at least believe it. So a necessary condition for knowledge is that it's got to be something that you believe. But if we stop the definition there, it wouldn't be sufficient because it would be subject to counterexamples. Why? Well, because there's plenty of things that I, you, and all sorts of people believe, but that we wouldn't want to count as knowledge, right? I might believe that my favorite sports team is going to win the championship, but that doesn't mean that I know that they will, right? I could say, I believe that the earth is flat, right? But that doesn't make it knowledge. So we need to add more to it. And once our definition is not troubled by counterexamples, then we've arrived at a promising philosophical definition. All right, let's get started by looking at different ways of defining words. So one of those ways is by stipulation. And this stands in distinction to what I will call a proper definition. So this is two important kinds or ways of defining words. So on a stipulative definition, you're not really trying to define the word in a way that everyone will find acceptable. You're not necessarily using the word as it would be used in any good dictionary. You're merely telling your reader or your listener, you're stipulating how you're going to use a term. And there are no restrictions on this. It doesn't have to actually be correct. It's sort of a personal, subjective definition. Or if you're going to use a term in a special way, then you might just stipulate, for the course of this conversation, for this paper, when I say blah blah blah, it's going to mean this. And again, there are no rules. So I could stipulate that the definition of God refers to my pet banana slug. Right? And that would be fine just because I'm stipulating it. But what philosophers are after when they investigate philosophical concepts like friendship, freedom, personal identity, moral permissibility, moral rightness, evil, God, knowledge, etc. We're trying to do more than just stipulate. We're trying to come up with the correct or the right, or what I say, the proper definition, the objective definition of the term. And there's going to be an interplay here. There's going to be a give and take between when a definition is informative and when it is correct. So a proper definition can be really informative, but it's not necessarily right. Okay, so let's look at different kinds of definitions now. So the first one is definition by example. So this is one we should all be familiar with. So this is where you point something out or you just give an instance When you say, sometimes you say when you're writing for example, for instance, you're giving an example. So let's take the word planet. I could define that by just pointing out, hey, Mars, that's an example of a planet. If you didn't know what a planet was, you could just point out, oh yeah, there's this planet, it's sort of red. It's a little bit further from the Earth. It's further from the sun than the Earth is. But notice again the interplay between being correct and informative. Certainly that's correct that Mars is a planet, but if you didn't know really what a planet was, then that wouldn't be very informative. Here's a better example of what I mean by not being very informative. Let's say I make up a word, snorg. S-N-O-R-G-S. The plural, snorgs. And so you say, well, okay, you made up this word, Ryan. Well, what does it mean? Well, I don't tell you what it means in detail. I just say, oh, I'll give you examples, and you can figure it out. So I tell you, these are all examples of snorgs. Doors are snorgs, wood, sweets. Those are all snorgs. Oh, so don't you know what it is? Now, some of you might be able to figure it out, but a lot of people might not. You might say, well, okay, those are examples, but you're not really getting at what it is. What are the requirements to being a snorg? Give me more information. So here's the definition that gives you more information. A snorg is something that is spelled with double letters. All right? A snorg is anything whose word in English used to refer to the thing is spelled with double letters. So that definition that gives you more information is called an analytical definition, or an analytic, I'll sometimes say. So let's talk about that. So we've got definition by example, an analytical definition, or analytic, and definition by synonym. So synonyms, as most of you already know, is just a replacement word or phrase. But again, just like examples, they can be helpful and informative, but they're not nearly as informative as an analytic or analytical definition. Here's another example of that case. So take the word punctilious. That's not a very commonly known word. And you might say, well, I want to know what this means. Tell me what it means. And I say, okay, I define it by synonym. I tell you that it means fastidious. Those are synonyms. But that doesn't help you because you don't know what fastidious means. So I'm correct, those are synonyms, but they're not very informative. So both those words mean sort of anal retentive and clean and overly organized and neat to a point of obsession, kind of OCD. So what I've just given you is the analytic definition. And those are the most informative and precise. Okay, the way we come up with an analytic definition is we employ a method that philosophers have used for centuries called classical analysis. And when we give the classical analysis, we want to know the criteria for the word. We want to know the requirements. What is required in being fastidious? Let's do a simple example with the word square. So when you do a classical analysis of square, you want an analysis that tells you about all the squares, but you also want it to tell you only about squares. Right? So if I say that a square is a shape, well, my definition surely captures all the squares, but it includes many other things that aren't squares, like circles and triangles. So when you're going through this sort of definition process, you want to make sure that your definition is neither too broad nor too narrow. So if you say that a square is a shape with 4 sides, that's still too broad. And notice, bringing back counterexamples, if my definition is a square is anything with 4 sides, you can come up with a counterexample. You can come up with an example that counters the definition, hence the term counterexample. So there are some rectangles and rhombuses that are a shape with 4 sides, but they are not squares. Right? So if you have a rectangle that's really kind of long, has a long length and a smaller width, then that wouldn't be a square. But it certainly is a shape with 4 sides. So being a shape with 4 sides, that's a requirement. It's a necessary condition, but we need to add more. So we want the conditions to be all requirements, and then together we want them to be enough. We want them to be what we call jointly sufficient. So the definition is not jointly sufficient. The conditions aren't jointly sufficient because our definition is too broad. So we need to add more. Let's add a square is a shape with 4 equal sides, but still we're not done yet because of rhombuses. You can have a rhombus that, there are rhombuses, or rhombusi, or whatever it is, that have 4 equal sides that are shapes, but they're still not squares because the angles within the rhombus don't have to be 90 degrees. So we need to add that. So if we stipulate that the angles must all be 90 degrees, then we'll be good. So a square is a closed shape, 4 equal sides, and has 4 right angles. 4 right interior angles. And we've done it. So all of those conditions are requirements, they're necessary, and together they pick out squares and only squares. It's not subject to counterexamples. So we say again, they're jointly sufficient. Notice that if you just say shape, that's sufficient to get all the squares. But then you're missing the other side, the flip side. You're still subject to counterexamples because you don't have all the necessary conditions. Also notice if we kept on going, if we added the condition of being blue, we still would be problematic because the definition is too narrow, right? We would have all the blue squares, but we would be missing out on the red ones. So in that case, our definition would be too narrow. So one of the main points here is definitions are important to communication. And in philosophy, when you are running a classical analysis to come up with the meaning of, say, free will, or right and wrong, or evil, or God, you don't want that analysis. Analysis is a synonym for definition in philosophy. You don't want that analysis to be too broad, neither too narrow. Okay, so that was a classical analysis. So here are a couple other ones from the history of philosophy. One goes back to this French philosopher, Descartes. And Descartes claimed that he defined body in not like a flesh and blood human body, but kind of a physical body in general. And he says it's a body if and only if it's extended in both space and time. So if you're going to be if you're going to be a physical object, then you have to have shape and form, right? So you have to be extended in space, and you also have to exist over a period of time. Now you might see this phrase, if and only if. Why did Descartes use that? Well, that's just saying that the definition goes both directions. So another way to put that definition would be this way. If it's a body, then it's extended in both space and time. And if it's extended both in space and time, then it's a body. Here's another one from Hume about miracles. Something is a miracle, so that x is a variable. Something is a miracle if and only if x is 1, an event caused by God's will, that 2 violates the laws of nature. So let's see if we can come up with any counterexamples to Hume's definition, or Descartes'. So there's Descartes, there's Hume. So let's challenge them. Well, Descartes' will be difficult. Well, first, that definition isn't that interesting, but it seems pretty intuitive. But in theory, to come up with a counterexample, you'd need to think of something that's a body but not extended in both space and time, or something that's extended both in space and time that's not a body, and that could be difficult. But I think for Hume's definition, we can come up with a counterexample. We either would think of something that's a miracle that's not both caused by God's will and violates the laws of nature, or we think of an event that's caused by God's will and violates the laws of nature that's not a miracle. And I think the former direction will be the one to challenge. I think that there are a lot of events that don't violate the laws of nature that people consider to be miracles. For example, if there is a horrendous car accident on the interstate and there's a 50 car pileup and you're in the middle of it, but somehow you walk away without a scrape or a bruise, you could argue that was a miracle. Now, it wasn't as if any laws were violated of nature. It was a physical event. If you ran the physics on it, there would be nothing out of the ordinary. You've got the masses of the cars and the forces and the acceleration and friction and the physics of human biology, physiology, etc. So there don't have to be any laws that were violated, but it still might be a miracle. So that would be a counterexample to Hume's definition that has been put forth by others in the history of philosophy. Okay, so I want to end this mini lecture on definitions and counterexamples by just noting that in the last 100 years or so, philosophers have started to recognize that there might be limits on classical analysis. It might be too difficult. It seems like there are always counterexamples. And it might be that concepts and objects in the world, at least some of them, aren't truly subject to such a clean-cut analysis. One reason for this is after 2,000 years of doing it, we have very few analyses to show for it. Right? So I just showed you a couple, but there aren't that many. You would think after 2,000 years we would have a lot of them. The problem is it can be difficult to figure out what is common to any one object or concept. There might not be a common criterion or set of criteria. You might say, well, what do you mean? Well, for example, take the concept games, right? Chess, checkers, jack, solitaire, baseball, anyone would tell you that those are all games, but there might not be a common thread for all of them. You know, you could try and say, well, it's for fun, or there's an object, or you play it. You know, maybe there would be something, but you know, some games might not be fun. You know, some people have tried to take a shot at this, but it's pretty tough. So in the 20th century, Wittgenstein, who we've talked about in this course, he proposed that for some words, concepts, there might not be a common thread. And in this case with games, he gave the example of games. There might not be one thing that all games have in common. So instead of a single common thread, he proposed that maybe the way concepts in the world works is that there are more overlapping commonalities that he described as family resemblances. And so one way to think about this is to imagine a piece of rope, right? So you got one piece of rope, but a lot of times there's not a single thread that runs the entire way through the rope. There's not a single common thread, but there are many pieces that are woven together so tightly that we still call it a single rope. Okay, so that's it for definitions and counterexamples.